My name is Sarah Carter, and 2 years ago I collapsed on a graduation stage in Anchorage, Alaska. I was 22 years old. As the paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher, the university officials kept dialing my parents' emergency contact numbers. Every single call went straight to voicemail. 3 days later, I woke up in the intensive care unit, hooked up to a ventilator. The first thing I saw was not my mother holding my hand. It was an Instagram photo my older sister had just posted. My mother, my father, and my sister clinking margaritas with the caption, "Family trip to Miami Beach, no stress, no drama." I had 115 missed calls from my father sitting on my home screen. I found out later he was not calling because he heard I was in a coma. He was calling because he realized he had lost control of my financial future. Before I tell you what the hospital found and the secret inheritance that tore everything apart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to that Saturday morning. I stood in the staging area of the university auditorium. I was about to receive my nursing degree with honors. The room smelled like hairspray and cheap polyester. 2,000 people were finding their seats in the bleachers. I kept checking my phone. I had sent my mother a text at 6 in the morning with a picture of my cap and gown. Read at 6:15. No reply. I peeked through the velvet curtains. I had reserved 3 seats in the third row right on the aisle so my dad could stretch his legs. Section B, row 3 seats, 12, 13, and 14. As the auditorium filled with families carrying grocery store bouquets and handmade signs, those 3 seats remained empty. I told myself it was just Anchorage traffic. The snow was heavy that morning, but my stomach was twisting into tight knots, or at least I thought it was just anxiety. I had been ignoring a sharp ache in my side for 3 days. According to the American Association of Critical Care Nurses, 67% of trauma nurses report severe burnout within 3 years. But I had welcomed the grueling 14-hour tech shifts at Providence, Alaska Medical Center. I practically lived in the emergency room just to avoid the coldness of my own house. I cash flowed my entire tuition by cleaning up blood and running labs on 3 hours of sleep. I thought this piece of paper would finally make them look at me. The dean stepped up to the podium and the ceremony began. The pain in my abdomen shifted from a dull ache to a burning knife. By the time they reached the letter C, I was sweating through my gown. Sarah Carter, magna cum laude. I heard my name echo over the speakers. I stepped out from the curtain and walked toward the center of the stage. I looked at row 3, still empty. A woman next to them was resting her coat on seat 12. I reached out to take the diploma cover from the dean. As my fingers brushed the leather, something inside me ruptured. The stage lights flared. The applause faded into a high-pitched ring. My knees hit the hardwood floor first. I heard someone scream into the microphone. Then the world went dark. I surfaced from the dark slowly. The first sensation was not pain, but the bitter chill of the room. My throat felt like it was coated in sand. I tried to swallow, and my body responded with a sharp, agonizing pull across my abdomen. I opened my eyes to a blinding white ceiling and the steady rhythmic hum of medical machinery. I was in the intensive care unit at Providence, Alaska Medical Center. Through the small window to my left, I could see the unforgiving Anchorage winter. Thick sleet was slamming against the reinforced glass. The sky was the color of bruised iron. I turned my head. The movement sent a fresh wave of nausea through my chest. I expected to see my mother pacing the floor. I expected to see my father sitting in the corner with a stale cup of coffee. I expected the people who had raised me to be hovering over my bed demanding answers from the doctors. The chairs beside my bed held only 2 people. My best friend Jess sat slumped in a blue plastic chair. Her dark hair was messy, and she was wearing the same scrubs she had worn 3 days ago. Beside her stood my grandmother, Evelyn. Evelyn was 74 years old and stood as straight as a pine tree. She wore her thick wool coat over a simple dress. Her face was set in hard, unreadable lines. She was not crying. Evelyn rarely cried. She just watched the door like a guard waiting for an intruder. Jess heard the rustle of my sheets and snapped her head up. Her eyes were bloodshot. She rushed to the edge of the bed and pressed the call button for the nurse. She did not offer me a generic platitude. She did not tell me everything was fine. She just poured a small cup of water and held a plastic straw to my cracked lips. I took a sip. The cool water felt like a lifeline. "Where are they?" My voice was a broken rasp. It barely sounded human. Jess and Evelyn exchanged a look. It was the kind of look you give someone before you deliver news that will alter the rest of their life. Jess reached into her coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked in the top corner from when I had dropped it on the auditorium stage. She placed the heavy device into my palm. My fingers were stiff and wrapped in medical tape. "Look for yourself, Sarah." Jess kept her voice low. Her tone was vibrating with a specific type of rage I had never heard from her before. I pressed the side button. The screen illuminated the dim hospital room. I swiped up to unlock it. The phone opened directly to an Instagram notification. It was a post from my older sister Lexi. I stared at the image. My brain struggled to process the bright, vibrant colors against the sterile backdrop of my reality. The photo showed Lexi, my mother Susan, and my father David sitting at a beachfront restaurant. The sky behind them was a flawless tropical blue. Palm trees framed the edges of the picture. They were holding up oversized frozen margaritas. My mother was wearing a new pair of designer sunglasses. My father was wearing a floral shirt I had never seen before. Lexi was in the center, leaning forward with a wide, practiced smile. I read the caption beneath the photo. "Finally, a family trip to Miami Beach. No stress, no drama." The words felt like physical blows. I read them again. "No stress, no drama." I looked at the timestamp. The photo had been posted 2 days ago. My mind started to run the cold logistical arithmetic. Anchorage to Miami is not a casual flight. It is a grueling 14-hour travel day. You have to fly out of Alaska down to Seattle and then cross the entire country. To be sitting on a beach in Florida with sunburns and fresh drinks meant they had boarded a plane on Saturday morning. They were walking through the airport security line at the exact moment I was standing in my cheap polyester graduation gown, waiting for them to arrive. They were ordering their first round of drinks, while the surgeon was cutting into my stomach to remove my ruptured appendix and clean out the deadly sepsis. This was not a last-minute scheduling error. This was a premeditated, coordinated abandonment. They had planned this vacation for weeks. They had packed summer clothes, hidden their luggage, and lied straight to my face. My mother had read my text message on graduation morning, knowing she was already sitting at her departure gate. I felt a strange, numbing sensation spread through my chest. It was not sorrow. It was the death of hope. For 22 years, I had played the role of the reliable daughter. I worked double shifts. I paid my own bills. I asked for nothing. I thought my grit would eventually earn their respect. I thought this degree would be the moment they finally looked at me and felt pride. But looking at that photo, I realized the truth. They did not just overlook me, they actively discarded me. My graduation was an inconvenience. My existence was the drama they needed a vacation from. I closed the Instagram application. The home screen appeared and my breath caught in my throat. A red notification bubble hovered over my phone icon. 115 missed calls. I tapped the icon. The call log scrolled endlessly. Dad, 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 Dad. The timestamps told a bizarre story. The calls did not start on Saturday when the hospital was frantically trying to reach my emergency contacts. The hospital had called them 5 times and left voicemails explaining I was in critical condition. My parents had ignored those. The avalanche of 115 calls had started a mere 12 hours ago, long after they had posted their beach photo, long after they had settled into their resort. My father had called me back to back, sometimes 3 times in a single minute. I backed out of the call log and opened my text messages. There were 0 messages asking about my graduation. There were 0 messages asking if I was safe. There was only one recent text from my father. "We need you. Answer now." I stared at those 5 words. We need you, not we love you, not we are so sorry. We need you. It was the same phrase they always used when Lexi overdrew her bank account and they wanted me to cover her rent. It was the same phrase they used when my father needed a quick loan to cover a bad investment. They only ever reached out when they needed a utility player to fix a mess. But I was lying in a hospital bed with staples in my abdomen. I had nothing left to give them. I let the phone drop onto the thin hospital blanket. The screen went dark. The silence in the room was heavy. "They know," Evelyn said. Her voice cut through the hum of the heart monitor. I turned my head to look at my grandmother. She stepped closer to the bed and placed her warm, weathered hand over mine. Her grip was firm. "Know what?" I asked. My voice was barely a whisper. Evelyn looked down at me. Her eyes were sharp and clear. "They did not call you 115 times because they listened to the voicemails from the surgical team, Sarah. They do not know you are in this hospital. They do not know you almost died on that stage." "Then why are they calling?" Evelyn reached out and smoothed the hair back from my forehead. Her face hardened into a mask of grim satisfaction. "They are calling because a deadline passed. Your grandfather knew exactly what kind of people your parents were. He knew they would drain you dry to fund your sister's fantasies. He made a plan before he died, and he made me swear to keep it a secret until the exact right moment." I tried to sit up, but the pain forced me back down. "What plan?" "Your parents received a certified legal notice at their hotel in Miami 12 hours ago," Evelyn stated. The words landed like bricks in the quiet room. "The estate attorney informed your father that he has officially lost control. They are panicking because the golden goose just grew wings." I looked at the black screen of my phone. The 115 missed calls suddenly made perfect sense. They were not calling out of grief. They were calling out of sheer financial terror. To understand the panic radiating from those missed calls, you have to understand the cold arithmetic of my childhood. Financial terror sounds like an exaggeration until you realize how my family operated behind closed doors. People often use the term glass child to describe siblings who fade into the background while their parents focus entirely on a more demanding brother or sister. They think being a glass child just means being ignored. But the greatest danger of being a glass child is not invisibility. It is becoming the load-bearing pillar for a structurally unsound family. I was not just their reliable daughter. I was their invisible utility. I was the silent foundation they built their chaotic lives upon. Lexi was the fragile center of our universe. She demanded constant validation and endless resources. Whenever she conjured up a new dream, my parents scrambled to finance it regardless of the cost. When Lexi decided she wanted to be an entrepreneur, my parents did not ask for a business plan. They did not review her profit margins. They simply remortgaged their house to hand her a $60,000 loan. Lexi leased a premium storefront in downtown Anchorage. She painted the walls blush pink and stocked the shelves with imported silk scarves and overpriced artisanal candles. She just wanted the aesthetic of owning a boutique. I remember watching her unlock the front door on opening day while my mother beamed with pride. 6 months later, the blush pink walls were bare and the windows were papered over with brown butcher paper. Lexi got bored. She grew tired of managing inventory, arriving early to open the doors, and dealing with frustrated vendors. The business tanked. Debt collectors started calling the house line at all hours of the day. My parents absorbed the crushing financial blow without a single word of reprimand. My father drained his retirement savings to pay off her commercial lease. My mother rubbed Lex's back and told her the failure was a valuable learning experience. They shielded her from every consequence. While they subsidized her delusions, I was financing my own survival. I worked double shifts at the hospital. I picked up overtime whenever a senior nurse called in sick. I spent my nights cleaning up bodily fluids, restraining combative patients, and logging patient vitals. I saved every single paycheck. I built a fortress of financial security, one grueling hour at a time. That stark contrast brings me back to a very specific Tuesday evening in December 2024. I was standing at the Diamond Center transit stop waiting for the city bus. The Alaskan sleet was coming down in sideways sheets, driven by a bitter wind sweeping off the Chugach Mountains. The temperature was hovering near zero. My winter coat was thin, and my scrubs were soaked through from a chaotic trauma shift. I still smelled like iodine and medical-grade bleach. My hands were so numb I could barely operate my phone. I opened my banking application just to remind myself why I was enduring the misery. I needed to see the numbers to keep myself moving forward. The screen loaded and displayed my savings balance, $34,000. I stared at the green numbers. That money was not just currency. It was blood, sweat, and missed sleep. It was the tuition for my nursing degree. It was my ticket out of their house. As I stood shivering in the wind, a new email notification dropped down from the top of my phone screen. It was an alert from the Shared Family Credit Monitoring Service. My mother had linked my email to the account years ago and never bothered to remove it. The alert stated that Susan Carter had just co-signed a new auto loan. The principal amount was $45,000. I stood in the freezing sleet and read the details. Lexi had complained that her reliable sedan was getting too old and lacked the modern features her friends had. She wanted a brand new Audi. My mother signed the dealership paperwork without blinking an eye. I had $34,000 earned through bone-deep exhaustion. Lexi had a luxury vehicle handed to her simply because she asked. I did not confront them when I finally got home that night. I never confronted them. I knew the rules of our household. Whenever I achieved a milestone or demonstrated independence, my mother Susan made sure to put me in my place. She viewed my competence as an insult to Lexi's fragility. I remember the afternoon I made the university dean's list. I walked into the kitchen holding the official letter. Susan was standing at the counter chopping vegetables for dinner. I placed the letter next to her cutting board. She glanced at the heavy cardstock and sighed deeply. She did not offer a congratulations. She did not smile. She slid the letter back across the granite counter and told me to put it away. She told me to stop showing off because my academic success made Lexi feel inadequate about dropping out of community college. My achievements were treated as personal attacks against my sister. I was systematically conditioned to shrink myself to keep the peace. I learned to hide my grades in the bottom of my backpack. I learned to hide my bank statements. I learned to minimize my exhaustion so Lexi could complain about how tired she was from shopping. My fatal flaw was believing my financial utility would eventually buy their unconditional love. I thought if I just worked hard enough and proved my undeniable worth, they would finally look at me the way they looked at Lexi. I allowed myself to be trapped in an endless cycle of people-pleasing. When the boutique failed and my father fell behind on the mortgage, I quietly transferred $2,000 into his checking account. When Lexi decided she needed a mental health month and quit her part-time job, I paid her rent. I became the invisible machine they plugged into whenever their poor choices caught up with them. They took my money with entitled silence. There were no thank you notes. There was only the expectation that Sarah would handle it. Lying in that hospital bed, with the cold light of the intensive care unit washing over me, the arithmetic of their current panic made perfect sense. I was the anchor stopping their ship from crashing into the rocks. They had planned to ambush me on graduation day. They knew I had saved a fortune. They knew I was about to step into a high-paying career. They needed me to sign away my future to cover the crater Lexi had left in their finances. I looked back up at Grandma Evelyn. Her face was stern and unapologetic. She had watched this parasitic dynamic unfold for 2 decades. She saw me freezing at the bus stop while they bought luxury cars. She heard Susan scold me for earning top grades. Evelyn knew my parents would eventually drain my bank accounts down to zero if someone did not intervene. Evelyn reached into her thick wool coat. She pulled out a heavy legal envelope sealed with red wax. She placed it carefully onto my lap, resting it just above the surgical staples in my abdomen. "Your grandfather did not leave things to chance, Sarah," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady and carried the weight of a judge reading a final verdict. "He saw how they treated you. He knew the exact moment they would try to break you for good. He spent the last year of his life setting a trap, and 12 hours ago your father stepped right into it. I stared at the red wax seal. The seal bore the emblem of the most ruthless estate law firm in Anchorage. My hands trembled as I reached out to break it open. I was about to discover the $1 million secret that had sent my family running for their lives. My thumb slid under the thick paper of the envelope. The red wax cracked into pieces against my hospital gown. I pulled out a stack of dense legal papers. The header bore the name of a prestigious estate law firm located in downtown Anchorage. To make sense of the document, I need to tell you about my grandfather. Arthur Carter was a quiet man who understood the value of silence and strategy. He made his fortune buying vast tracts of raw Alaskan wilderness long before the commercial developers realized the potential of the land. He wore faded flannel shirts and drove a battered truck, but his mind operated with the precision of a corporate banker. During the last few years of his life, he used to sit on our back porch and watch our family dynamics unfold. He saw Susan coddling Lexi and treating her like royalty. He saw David making reckless financial bets and draining his retirement accounts. Most importantly, he saw me scrubbing floors and working late nights just to buy my own school supplies. He never intervened in the shouting matches. He never lectured my parents about their parenting. He simply observed and took meticulous notes. I scanned the first page of the heavy document. The legal jargon was dense, but a few phrases jumped out at me. I saw the words, irrevocable blind trust. I saw a geographical designation for the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. What does this mean? I asked my grandmother. My voice was raspy, but the sheer confusion gave it a sudden strength. Evelyn pointed a weathered finger to a specific paragraph near the bottom of the page. Read the asset description, she instructed. I forced my tired eyes to focus on the small black text. The document listed 400 acres of prime commercial timberland located in the heart of the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. It detailed ongoing sustainable logging leases and harvest rights. The estimated appraisal value attached to the bottom of the schedule was staggering. The land was worth nearly $1 million. My heart hammered against my ribs. The monitors beside my bed began to beep at a faster tempo. I looked at Evelyn and Jess in total disbelief. I do not own commercial timberland, I said. You do now, Evelyn replied calmly. And you always were going to. Evelyn pulled a chair closer to the edge of my bed and sat down. She explained the legal architecture my grandfather had secretly constructed before his heart failed 5 years ago. He knew my father was a sinking ship. He knew my parents treated me like a disposable asset. He wanted to give me a shield to protect my future, but he understood human nature. He knew if he handed me a fortune while I was a teenager, my parents would coerce me into signing it away to fund Lexi's endless demands. So he utilized the Alaska Trust Act. He placed the Matanuska-Susitna Valley acreage into an ironclad legal structure. He named my father as the temporary custodian. This designation meant David could look at the asset on paper. He received annual statements showing the land appreciating in value. He could see the timber leases generating revenue into a locked holding account, but the blind trust restricted him from touching a single cent. He could not sell the land. He could not leverage it for a loan to save Lex's failing boutique. He could only watch the wealth grow behind a pane of bulletproof legal glass. There was only one trigger mechanism built into the trust. The entire estate would vest and transfer exclusively to me the exact moment I turned 22 years old. I did the mental math lying there in the hospital bed. My 22nd birthday was last Friday. It was the day before my graduation ceremony. It was the day before my appendix ruptured. Your father has been salivating over that land for 5 years, Evelyn said. Her tone was sharp and unforgiving. His debts are catching up to him. He owes money to private lenders for the boutique. He has a balloon payment due on the house. He needed that timberland to avoid total bankruptcy. I stared at the paperwork as the pieces of the puzzle began snapping into place with terrifying precision. They knew my birthday was the trigger. They knew I would inherit the land on Friday. That was their real plan for my graduation weekend. They were never going to celebrate my nursing degree. They had intended to take me to a quiet dinner. They planned to slide a quitclaim deed across the table next to my dessert. They were going to play on my lifelong desperation for their approval. They would have told me that handing over the land was the only way to save the family from ruin. They would have framed it as a test of my loyalty. And the saddest part was, they were right. If they had smiled at me and told me they were proud of me, I probably would have signed away my entire future right there in the restaurant just to keep their affection. But greed makes people arrogant. Susan and David felt so confident in my submissive nature, they decided they did not need to stick around Anchorage. They wanted to celebrate Lexi's new engagement on a beach. They figured they could fly to Miami, drink margaritas, and handle the paperwork with me when they returned. They thought I was a predictable and obedient pawn who would wait patiently for their instructions. They miscalculated the efficiency of my grandfather's estate attorney. Evelyn tapped the legal folder resting on my lap. On Saturday morning, while you were putting on your graduation gown and they were ordering drinks by the ocean, the attorney executed the transfer. He sent a formal certified digital notice directly to your father's inbox. The notice informed David that the trust had officially vested. It stated that Sarah Carter was now the sole owner of the Matanuska-Susitna Valley acreage. And most importantly, it stripped David of all managerial oversight. He was locked out of the accounts. He was removed from the deed. The asset was gone. The 115 missed calls on my phone were not driven by concern. They were driven by pure, unadulterated financial terror. David was sitting in a tropical paradise realizing his golden goose had just grown wings and flown the coop. He needed me to answer the phone immediately. He needed to manipulate me and secure a verbal agreement before I checked my own mail and realized I was sitting on $1 million empire. I felt a strange laugh bubbling up in my chest. It hurt my surgical incisions, but I could not stop it. I was lying in an intensive care unit surviving on intravenous antibiotics and ice chips. Meanwhile, the people who had abandoned me were hyperventilating in a luxury resort, realizing their financial lifeline was permanently severed. For the first time in my life, I held the power. I did not just have my nursing degree and my hard-earned savings. I owned a piece of the Alaskan frontier. I had tangible, undeniable leverage. I looked at Jess. She was grinning from ear to ear. "It is the ultimate karma," she said softly. "They ignored your graduation and it cost them $1 million. I touched the heavy paper of the deed. I felt a surge of unfamiliar strength. I was ready to ignore them forever. I was ready to let them drown in the debt they had created for Lexi. I assumed the battle was over. I assumed the silent treatment would be my final revenge. But the atmosphere in the room shifted. Evelyn did not share our relief. Her posture remained rigid. She looked away from the legal documents and stared at the heavy wooden door of my hospital room. "The missed calls stopped 3 hours ago, Sarah," Evelyn said. Her voice was stripped of any warmth. I checked the call log on my phone. She was right. The frantic back-to-back dialing had abruptly ceased at 2 in the afternoon. I figured they had just given up. I figured they were boarding a flight back to Anchorage to confront me in person. They did not give up. Evelyn continued. "Your father realized you were not answering your cell phone. So he called your landlord. Your landlord told him you never came home from the university. Then he called the university and found out you collapsed on stage." A cold shiver ran down my spine. My father knew I was in the hospital. "He knows you are in the intensive care unit," Evelyn said, stepping closer to my bed. "He knows you are heavily sedated. He knows you cannot sign legal documents right now." "Why does that matter?" I asked, feeling the panic return to my chest. "Because David is not flying back to Anchorage to hold your hand," Evelyn replied. Her eyes locked onto mine with a fierce intensity. "He is flying back to execute a hostile takeover. While you were unconscious this morning, he hired a probate attorney. He is marching into a courthouse tomorrow morning to use your medical condition against you. He is going to claim you are mentally incapacitated." I felt the air leave my lungs. The victory I had felt seconds ago evaporated into pure dread. They were not just trying to manipulate me anymore. They were attempting a legal strike that would strip away my rights entirely. The word conservatorship hung in the sterile air of the hospital room. I was a trauma nurse, and I knew exactly what that legal mechanism entailed. We saw it in the emergency department when elderly patients with advanced dementia came in. A judge strips away your bodily autonomy and your financial independence, handing the keys to a court-appointed guardian. You lose the right to choose your own medical treatments. You lose the right to sign a lease. You lose the right to access your own bank accounts. You become a legal ghost. My father was not just trying to steal the Matanuska-Susitna Valley timberland. He was trying to erase my legal existence. He wanted to reduce me to the status of a child so he could raid the trust fund without my consent. Evelyn pulled a chair closer to my bed. She folded her hands in her lap. Her calmness was terrifying. She explained the timeline of their hostile takeover. When David realized the estate attorney had locked him out of the trust, he panicked. He booked the first flight out of Miami. He and Susan landed at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport late Sunday night. They did not drive to the hospital to check if I was breathing. They did not call the nurses' station for a status update on my sepsis. They drove straight to a midtown strip mall to meet a lawyer named Gregory Dunn. David had a long history of seeking out people who operated in the gray areas of the law. Whenever his real estate schemes or bad investments went sideways, he found someone willing to bend the rules. Gregory Dunn was a bottom-feeding attorney known for filing frivolous nuisance lawsuits and pushing ethical boundaries. For a premium cash retainer, Dunn drafted an emergency ex parte petition. The petition argued that my sudden septic shock and the resulting coma left me cognitively impaired. It painted my parents as devastated caretakers, stepping in to manage a sudden complex financial inheritance for their incapacitated daughter. They requested immediate temporary conservatorship. If a judge signed that piece of paper, David could walk into the bank and drain the Timberland revenue accounts before I even woke up from the anesthesia. I gripped the thin hospital sheets. The monitors tracked my rising heart rate. They were going to bury me while I was still breathing, I whispered. Evelyn shook her head. Her silver hair caught the harsh fluorescent light. They tried, she corrected. But they forgot who raised you. You have to understand my grandmother Evelyn to understand how she dismantled their scheme. Evelyn spent 40 years working as an administrative clerk for the Alaska court system. She knew every loophole, every filing procedure, and every lazy trick a desperate lawyer might attempt. When I turned 18, Evelyn noticed my mother snooping through my mail looking for bank statements. Evelyn recognized the warning signs of financial abuse. When I started nursing school 3 years ago, she sat me down at her kitchen table. She told me that trauma work exposed people to unpredictable risks. She insisted I fill out an advance healthcare directive and a durable power of attorney. I thought she was just being overly cautious. I signed the documents and let her file them away in her safe deposit box. Those 2 pieces of paper became the shield that saved my life. Early Monday morning, David, Susan, and their lawyer, Gregory Dunn, walked into the main lobby of Providence, Alaska Medical Center. They were dressed in wrinkled travel clothes. They carried briefcases and manila folders. They intended to corner the attending physician and secure a medical affidavit declaring me unfit to make decisions. They needed that signature to finalize the court filing. Evelyn was waiting for them. She had not slept in 2 days. She had spent the entire weekend sitting beside my bed. But when she saw my father's rental car pull into the parking lot, she went downstairs to the lobby. She stood right in front of the main elevators blocking their path to the intensive care unit. David tried to play the concerned patriarch. He demanded to see his daughter. He told Evelyn to step aside and let the family handle the tragedy. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She simply reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out the durable power of attorney and the advance healthcare directive. Both documents were notarized, stamped, and ironclad. They explicitly named Evelyn as my sole proxy for all medical and financial decisions in the event of my incapacitation. They also contained a specific exclusionary clause, a clause Evelyn had drafted herself, barring my parents from accessing my medical records or making decisions on my behalf. Gregory Dunn took one look at the documents and knew he was beaten. The power of attorney predated their emergency petition by 3 years. It was legally bulletproof. Dunn realized David had lied to him about my legal standing. The lawyer packed up his briefcase and walked out the sliding glass doors, leaving my parents standing alone in the hospital lobby. Susan started to cry. She attempted to cause a scene, hoping the hospital staff would take pity on a weeping mother. She wailed about how cruel her mother was being. She begged the security guards to let her upstairs to see her dying child. Evelyn turned to the head of hospital security. She handed him the legal paperwork and a photograph of my parents. She informed the guards that these two individuals were attempting to commit financial fraud against a vulnerable patient. She requested an immediate trespass order. The hospital administration did not hesitate. Providence, Alaska Medical Center takes patient security seriously, especially in the intensive care unit. The guards escorted David and Susan out of the building. They were formally banned from the hospital campus. Their names were flagged in the security system. If they stepped foot past the visitor parking lot, the Anchorage police would be called to arrest them for trespassing. "They are locked out," Sarah Evelyn said. She placed her hand over mine. "They cannot access your medical charts. They cannot touch the Timberland Trust." The judge threw out their petition the moment the power of attorney was filed with the court clerk. "Your money is safe. You are safe." I let out a long, trembling breath. The crushing weight on my chest began to lift. I looked at Jess, who was smiling from her chair. I looked at my grandmother, who had stood like a sentinel at the gates of my life. For the first time, I realized what a real family looked like. It was not defined by shared blood. It was defined by the people who stood in front of the elevators and refused to let the wolves inside. I leaned back against the pillows. The physical pain in my abdomen was severe, but my mind felt sharper than it had in years. The fog of people-pleasing had burned away. The desperate need for my parents' approval had died on that graduation stage. I did not want their love anymore. I wanted my freedom. I turned to Jess. "How long until the doctors clear me for discharge?" I asked. Jess checked the whiteboard on the wall. "The attending physician said your white blood cell count is dropping. If you keep improving, they will remove the central line tomorrow. You could be discharged by Thursday morning." Thursday. That gave me 48 hours to prepare. I could not go back to my old apartment. My parents knew the address. They knew my schedule. They would be waiting for me. I needed a secure place to heal, and I needed to cut the final strings tying me to their sinking ship. "You are coming home with me," Jess said, reading my mind. I already cleared out the spare bedroom. My apartment building has a secure entry code and security cameras in the lobby. They cannot get near you. I nodded. "Thank you, Jess." But the relief was short-lived. As I lay in the bed plotting my silent exit, my phone vibrated on the mattress. I ignored it. I had ignored the device since discovering the missed calls. But then it vibrated again and again. It was not a phone call this time. It was a rapid succession of text messages breaking through the silence. I picked up the phone and looked at the lock screen. The messages were from my sister, Lexi. Lexi never texted me unless she needed money. She never texted me just to talk. I unlocked the screen and opened the message thread. The texts were frantic. "Sarah, you need to answer me. Mom is losing her mind. Dad just told Travis about the trust. Travis is furious. We need that money for the wedding deposits. Why are you doing this to us? Answer the phone right now, or I am coming to the hospital." I stared at the messages. Lexi still believed she was the center of the universe. She still believed my assets belonged to her. She thought she could bully me into submission from a distance. Then the final text came through. It made my blood run cold. "If you do not call Dad back in 5 minutes, he is going to call your nursing board. He is going to tell them you are stealing family money and abusing prescription drugs. He will ruin your career before it even starts." I showed the message to Evelyn. Her jaw tightened. The failed conservatorship was just their first strike. They realized they could not steal my money through the courts, so they were pivoting to extortion. A trauma nursing license in Alaska is heavily regulated. Accusations of drug diversion or moral turpitude trigger an immediate suspension pending a formal investigation. A state investigator would show up at the hospital unannounced. Even if the claims were proven entirely false, the investigation takes months to clear. Providence, Alaska Medical Center would rescind my new job offer immediately due to liability. The threat was a calculated strike at my only remaining source of income outside the trust. It showed my father's ruthless pragmatism. He could not get the timberland, so he wanted to starve me out. I realized the battle was far from over. Locking them out of my hospital room was only a temporary fix. I was stepping into a war, and they were willing to destroy my hard-earned reputation to get what they wanted. I had to disappear before they could follow through on their threat. Thursday morning arrived with a layer of thick ice clinging to the hospital windows. The attending physician signed my discharge papers just before 8 o'clock. The physical pain in my abdomen was still a sharp and constant reminder of the surgery, but the mental fog had lifted entirely. I was leaving the hospital, but I knew I could not walk out the front doors. My parents had been escorted off the property, but they were desperate. Desperate people do not just go home. They wait in parking lots. They sit in idling rental cars. Jess drove her old Subaru up to the rear service exit near the loading docks. A friendly security guard who knew the situation escorted us down the service elevator. I climbed into the passenger seat and kept my head low as we pulled out of the medical campus. We did not see David or Susan. I watched the Anchorage snowbanks blur past the window. I was heading to Jess's apartment to begin the rest of my life. When we walked into her small 2-bedroom unit, the silence felt like a physical weight. It was safe. It was secure. I sat down on her secondhand sofa and pulled my phone out of my pocket. I needed to address the extortion threat Lexi had sent the night before. David was planning to call the Alaska Board of Nursing to accuse me of drug diversion. He wanted to paralyze my career before it even started. The old version of me would have called him begging him to stop. I would have offered him a few $1,000s to drop the false allegations. Instead, I fought back with cold, undeniable evidence. As soon as my surgical staples were removed the following week, I drove straight to a certified private laboratory in Midtown Anchorage. I paid out of pocket for a comprehensive hair follicle drug screen. It is the most rigorous substance test available, and it traces any chemical back for months. I waited 3 days for the results. The paperwork came back immaculate. I took that sealed laboratory report and walked directly into the office of the clinical nursing director at Providence, Alaska Medical Center. I did not cry. I did not act like a victim. I sat in the leather chair across from her desk and laid out the facts. I explained that I was the beneficiary of a contested family trust. I informed her that my estranged parents were attempting to extort me by threatening my professional license. I handed her the clean drug screen and a copy of the police trespass order from the hospital lobby. The director looked at the paperwork and then looked at me. She saw a young woman taking pragmatic, proactive steps to protect her patients and her license. She placed the documents into my secure personnel file. She told me that if David ever called the hospital, the administration would immediately forward his number to their legal department for harassment. The threat was neutralized. David had brought a knife to a gunfight and I had just disarmed him. With my career shielded, I initiated the information diet. I did not write a dramatic farewell letter. I did not send a long text message outlining their failures. Giving a narcissist a long emotional letter only gives them ammunition. They parse your words, they twist your sentences, and they feed on your pain. The only way to win a war against a parasite is to cut off the host. I blocked Susan. I blocked David. I blocked Lexi. I went into my phone settings and blocked every aunt, uncle, and cousin who had a history of carrying messages for my mother. I locked down all my social media accounts. I changed my banking passwords. I removed myself from the shared family phone plan and bought a new device. I vanished into thin air. In the quiet peace of my new boundaries, my life began to accelerate. I spent the next month sitting at Jess's kitchen table studying for the National Nursing Board examinations. The quiet was unfamiliar, but healing. There was no mother telling me I was studying too much. There was no sister demanding I drive her to the mall. I took the exam in early spring. The computer shut off at 75 questions, which is the minimum required to prove competency. 2 days later, my official license arrived in the mail. I officially accepted the premier position in the Level 1 trauma unit. My starting salary crossed the 6-figure mark. But the nursing salary was only one piece of the puzzle. The Matanuska Susitna Valley, timberland, was the real engine of my new life. Grandma Evelyn arranged a meeting for me with an elite estate fiduciary named Mr. Caldwell. His office was located on the top floor of a glass building overlooking the dark waters of the Cook Inlet. He was a pragmatic man who specialized in managing high-net-worth assets for young inheritors. Mr. Caldwell slid a thick leather binder across his mahogany desk. He explained that commercial timberland is not just empty woods. It is an active, breathing asset. He presented a portfolio of sustainable logging companies operating in the Alaskan interior. We selected a reputable firm that utilized selective harvesting to preserve the ecological health of the forest. I signed a 5-year lease granting them harvesting rights on a designated quadrant of the 400 acres. 2 weeks later, the first dividend check arrived in my name. I stared at the numbers printed on the heavy bank paper. It was more money in a single transaction than I had earned in 4 years of scrubbing hospital floors. It was not lottery money. It was generational wealth secured by my grandfather and activated by my survival. I did not buy a luxury sports car like my sister. I did not book a vacation to a tropical beach. I wanted something they could never take away. I wanted concrete and steel. I tasked Mr. Caldwell with setting up a blind limited liability company. Using the LLC as a shield to keep my name off the public property records, I purchased a home in South Addition. It is one of the most historic and secure neighborhoods in downtown Anchorage. The property was a stunning modern townhouse nestled behind a row of old-growth spruce trees. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the inlet, reinforced security doors, and a high-end alarm system. I paid the sizable down payment in cash. I moved my few belongings out of Jess's spare bedroom and into my new home. I bought quality furniture. I stocked the refrigerator. I stood in my quiet kitchen on a Tuesday evening drinking a cup of coffee and watching the snow fall over the city. I was 23 years old. I was a specialized trauma nurse earning a premium salary. I held $1 million commercial asset. I owned a fortress. I had built an impenetrable foundation while my family flailed in the dark. For months, they tried to find me. Evelyn told me that Susan drove past my old apartment building repeatedly, only to see a different tenant moving in. David tried calling the hospital human resources department, but was stonewalled by the legal team. They had no address to send their demands. They had no phone number to call. They were suffocating in the vacuum of my absence. The silence was driving them insane. Lexi was feeling the pressure more than anyone. Her lavish wedding was rapidly approaching, and the vendors were demanding their final $20,000 deposits. Her boutique was gone. Her parents' credit cards were maxed out. The family funds were bone dry. Lexi realized she could not reach me through private channels. She could not text me to demand a bailout. The Bank of Sarah was permanently shuttered, so she decided to change her strategy. If she could not manipulate me in private, she would try to destroy me in public. She assumed I was still the fragile people pleaser who would crumble at the first sign of social disapproval. She thought the threat of public humiliation would force me to open my checkbook and fund her dream wedding. She was about to launch a campaign that would test the strength of my new boundaries. She was about to find out that the quiet sister she used to bully was dead, and the woman living in the South Addition townhouse did not negotiate with terrorists. The silence in my new townhouse was a luxury I had never known, but for my sister Lexi, that same silence was a suffocating weight. Anchorage is the largest city in Alaska, but social circles here operate like a small, isolated town. Everyone knows everyone else, and reputation is currency. Lexi had built her entire identity on the illusion of limitless wealth. She had bragged to her friends about her upcoming wedding at the Alyeska Resort down in Girdwood. It was a premier venue with vaulted cedar ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chugach Mountains. The final invoice for the catering and the event space was $20,000. The payment was due 30 days before the ceremony. With her boutique shuttered and my parents' credit lines exhausted, Lexi had no way to pay the bill. She could not text me to demand a transfer. She could not coerce my father into bullying me. The legal walls I had built were holding firm. Cornered and desperate, Lexi resorted to the only survival tactic she knew. She decided to weaponize the community against me. Narcissists require an audience to function. When they lose control of their primary target, they try to control how other people perceive that target. Lexi decided to launch a public smear campaign to pressure me into breaking my silence. On a Tuesday evening, Lexi set up her phone on a tripod in her living room. She did not wear her usual designer clothes or heavy makeup. She wore a plain, oversized sweater. She tied her hair back to look stressed and fragile. She hit the record button and delivered an award-winning performance for her Facebook followers. The video was 10 minutes long and carefully edited. Lexi looked directly into the camera and let genuine tears roll down her cheeks. She spun a masterclass in manipulation. She claimed that I had exploited our grandfather's fading memory to insert a secret clause into his estate planning. She told the camera that I had used legal loopholes to steal the family inheritance right out from under our hard-working parents. She painted a picture of David and Susan as heartbroken elders who were now facing financial ruin because of my boundless greed. She ended the video by sobbing into her hands, stating that her dream wedding was canceled because her own sister had callously abandoned the family in their darkest hour. Within an hour, the video had hundreds of shares. The Anchorage gossip mill ignited. The extended family network, which I often refer to as the flying monkeys, swung into action. My mother had spent decades grooming her sisters and cousins to view Lexi as a delicate angel and me as the cold, difficult child. Aunt Brenda was the worst offender. Brenda was a woman who sent Lexi expensive jewelry for her birthdays, but gifted me generic drugstore lotion. Brenda watched the video and immediately mobilized the rest of the relatives. My new phone began to buzz relentlessly on my kitchen counter. Even though I had blocked their numbers on my previous device, they found my new contact information through a mutual acquaintance at the hospital. The text messages flooded my screen. They were long paragraphs filled with guilt and vitriol. Aunt Brenda sent a message demanding to know how I could sleep at night while my parents suffered. Cousin Mark sent a text calling me a sociopath for ruining my sister's big day. Old family friends I had not seen in years chimed in to tell me I needed to seek professional help and return the stolen money. They formed a digital mob intent on shaming me into submission. The old version of me would have felt a crushing wave of panic. The people-pleaser I used to be would have sat on the floor and cried. I would have typed out a 10-page essay detailing the truth about the conservatorship, the abuse, and the medical emergency. I would have begged them to believe my side of the story. I would have offered to pay for the wedding venue, just to make the horrible messages stop. But the woman standing in the South Addition townhouse was a lead trauma nurse. I spent my days stabilizing patients with life-threatening injuries. I knew how to triage a bleeding wound. I did not panic. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, walked over to my large living room window, and looked out at the snow falling over the inlet. I felt a calm, clinical detachment. I was not going to argue with people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I was not going to participate in a public screaming match. I decided to execute a surgical strike. I walked back to the kitchen counter and picked up my phone. I opened my photo gallery and found the two images that told the entire story of my graduation weekend. The first image was the screenshot I had taken of Lexi's Instagram post. It showed Lexi, David, and Susan sitting on the sunny patio in Miami Beach, holding their frozen margaritas. They were smiling and wearing sunglasses. The caption read, "Family trip to Miami Beach, no stress, no drama." The timestamp clearly displayed the exact date and time the photo was uploaded to the internet. The second image was the photograph I had taken of my own wrist while lying in the intensive care unit. It showed my pale skin resting against the blue hospital sheets. Wrapped tightly around my wrist was the plastic admittance bracelet from Providence, Alaska Medical Center. The barcode was visible. The admittance date and the time were printed in bold black ink. I used a simple photo editing application to place the two images side by side. The visual contrast was jarring. On the left was a tropical vacation funded by my parents. On the right was a medical barcode documenting a fight for survival. The timestamps on both images matched perfectly. I did not post this compilation to my own social media feed. I did not want public sympathy. I only wanted to neutralize the threat. I opened the text message thread from Aunt Brenda. I attached the dual image file. Below the picture, I typed a single sentence. They chose margaritas while I was on life support. I hit send. I copied that exact same image and that exact same sentence. I opened Cousin Mark's message thread and pasted it. I hit send. I went down the list of every single relative and family friend who had sent me an angry text. I replied to all of them with clinical precision. One picture, one sentence. No further explanation. I set the phone face down on the granite counter and went to take a hot shower. When I returned to the kitchen an hour later, the digital mob had been entirely silenced. The reaction was immediate and devastating to Lexi's narrative. The flying monkeys were enablers, but they were not stupid. Aunt Brenda and Cousin Mark could look at a timestamp. They could read a hospital bracelet. They realized in an instant that they had been weaponized to defend a lie. They realized that while they were sending me hateful messages, I possessed the undeniable proof of my parents' depravity. My phone did not buzz with further accusations. Instead, a few scattered apologies began to trickle in. Aunt Brenda sent a short message saying she did not know the whole story. Cousin Mark blamed Lexi for misleading him. I did not reply to any of their apologies. I deleted their message threads and blocked their numbers permanently. They had shown their true colors when they assumed the worst of me, and I had no interest in offering them absolution. The fallout hit Lexi like an avalanche. The relatives who had initially shared her tearful Facebook video began deleting it from their profiles. A few bold family members confronted Susan, demanding to know why she was drinking on a beach while her daughter was having emergency surgery. Susan had no defense. The lie was exposed. By midnight, Lexi had quietly deleted the Facebook video. The public smear campaign was dead. She had tried to rally the community to force my hand, but all she accomplished was revealing her own toxic foundation to the entire extended family. She had isolated herself, and she still did not have the $20,000 for the wedding venue. I went to sleep that night feeling a profound sense of peace. The boundaries I had built were holding. The walls of my fortress were strong. I assumed the wedding would simply be canceled and the drama would slowly fade into the background of my new life. But the ripple effect of the exposed lie had reached someone outside the family circle. It reached someone who did not care about family loyalty or moral high grounds. Lexus? Fiancé. Travis was a man who worked the commercial fishing boats out of Homer. He was a pragmatist who liked the illusion of wealth Lexi provided. Travis had watched the Facebook video. He had seen the relatives turn their backs. He had demanded to see the bank accounts and realized the family funds were bone dry. Travis recognized that the wedding was a sham and his future bride was entirely broke. Travis did not cancel the engagement and walk away gracefully. He saw an opportunity. He knew about the Matanuska Susitna Valley timberland, and he knew I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom. The next evening, as I walked out of the hospital sliding glass doors after a long trauma shift, I saw a dark, heavy-duty pickup truck idling near the employee parking lot. A tall man in a heavy canvas jacket stepped out of the driver's side and leaned against the door. He blocked my path to my car. It was Travis. He did not look angry. He looked calculating. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, tapping it against the hood of his truck. He smiled a tight, humorless smile and told me we needed to have a conversation about the price of his silence. Travis pushed his heavy shoulders off the hood of his truck. He did not raise his voice. He told me to get into my car and follow him to the 24-hour coffee shop located just across the street from the hospital campus. He stated that if I tried to drive away, he would walk straight into the hospital administration office and start causing a scene. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, clinical curiosity. I wanted to see exactly how far the rot in my family had spread. I parked my vehicle next to his truck outside the diner. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a red glow over the fresh snow. Before I opened my car door, I reached into my coat pocket. I unlocked my smartphone and opened the voice recording application. I hit the record button. I locked the screen, leaving the application running, and slipped the device deep into my pocket. I walked into the diner and slid into the vinyl booth across from him. The air smelled like burnt coffee and stale grease. Travis did not waste time with pleasantries. He reached into his canvas jacket and tossed a manila envelope onto the Formica table. He told me to open it. Inside were drafted legal documents. It was a sworn affidavit printed on official legal paper ready for a signature. I read the paragraphs. The document was a fabricated testimony. It stated that Travis had personally witnessed me experiencing severe cognitive decline over the past year. It claimed I had confessed to manipulating my grandfather's estate planning while the old man was heavily medicated. It was a complete work of fiction designed to look like a devastating legal weapon. To understand why Travis was doing this, you have to understand where he came from. Travis grew up in Homer, Alaska. It is a small coastal town located at the end of the Kenai Peninsula. His father and his older brothers ran a fleet of commercial halibut boats. They were men built on grueling physical labor and an unshakable moral code. A handshake in their family was a binding contract. Travis was the outlier. He liked the aesthetic of the rugged Alaskan fisherman, but he hated the actual work. He gravitated toward my sister because my parents projected an illusion of effortless wealth. Travis wanted a free ride. He wanted to marry into a trust fund so he could buy his own boat and hire a crew to do the heavy lifting while he sat in the captain's chair. When my parents' funding dried up, Travis realized his future meal ticket was gone. But he knew about the Matanuska-Susitna Valley timberland, and he knew I was the sole beneficiary. Travis leaned over the table. He said he knew my sister was broke. He knew the wedding was a sham. He knew my parents were drowning in debt. But he also knew how the probate court system operated. He explained that if he submitted this sworn affidavit to a judge alongside my father's, complaints the court would issue an immediate injunction. They would freeze the Timberland Trust. The revenue would be locked in an escrow account for years while a drawn-out legal battle played out. He told me the lawyer fees alone would bankrupt me before I ever saw the inside of a courtroom. He laid out his terms. He did not want $1 million. He just wanted the $20,000 required to pay the Alyeska Resort venue deposit so he could save face and avoid public embarrassment. He also wanted $50,000 wired directly into his personal checking account to clear his own business debts. $70,000 total. He called it a minor convenience fee. He said if I paid the money, he would tear up the affidavit. He promised to dump my sister a few months after the wedding and leave me alone forever. He leaned back against the vinyl booth and took a sip of his black coffee, looking incredibly pleased with his own strategy. I needed to make sure the recording was airtight. I kept my voice perfectly level. I asked him to clarify his demands. I asked him if he was fully admitting that the affidavit was a fabricated lie. He laughed and said the truth does not matter in probate court, only the paperwork matters. I asked him to confirm that he was demanding $70,000 in exchange for not committing perjury. He smiled and said that was exactly what he was demanding. He told me I had 24 hours to transfer the funds, or he was driving to the courthouse to file the paperwork. I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out my phone and placed it flat on the table between us. I tapped the screen to stop the recording. The application saved the audio file instantly. Travis stopped smiling. He sat up straight and asked what I was doing. I looked at him with the same clinical detachment I use when assessing a severe trauma wound. I explained a specific legal statute to him. I told him that Alaska is a one-party consent state. That means as long as one person involved in a conversation consents to the recording, the audio is entirely legal. It is admissible in a court of law, and it is admissible to the public. I did not just threaten him with the recording. I executed the strike. I opened my messaging application. During the months he and my sister were dating, I had acquired the contact information for his father and his brothers. I created a group message containing his entire family. I attached the crystal-clear audio file of our conversation. I looked Travis dead in the eye and hit send. The color drained from his face. He scrambled to reach across the table to grab my phone, but I had already slid it back into my pocket. He realized the gravity of what had just happened. He had not just committed a felony extortion attempt. He had exposed himself as a parasite to the only people whose opinions he actually cared about. His father and brothers despised liars and thieves. Within 30 seconds, his cell phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed his father's name. The phone buzzed relentlessly against the Formica table. Travis stared at it, unable to answer. He looked like a man watching his own ship sink into the ocean. I stood up from the booth. I dropped a $5 bill on the table to cover the coffee and zipped up my coat. I told him he should probably answer that call. I walked out of the diner and drove back to my secure townhouse. The fallout was nuclear and immediate. His father did not tolerate extortion. By the time I woke up the next morning, the engagement was officially terminated. Travis packed his belongings into his truck and drove back down the Kenai Peninsula in utter disgrace. He blocked my sister's number and abandoned her in Anchorage. My sister's unearned kingdom was fully demolished. She had no venue. She had no fiancé. She had no money. The public humiliation was absolute. My parents were left standing in the rubble of their failed schemes. The legal avenues to steal my trust were blocked by my grandmother. The social manipulation had backfired, leaving them isolated. The extortion attempt had ended in disaster. But desperate people do not surrender when they run out of legitimate options. When narcissists lose all valid paths to power, they cross the line into criminality. David and Susan realized they could not touch the Timberland Trust, so they decided to bypass the trust entirely. They were about to commit a federal crime that would force me to choose between sending my own parents to prison or losing my identity. Working the night shift in the trauma unit during an Alaskan winter is a specific kind of crucible. The emergency department doors slide open, and the freezing air rushes in, carrying the aftermath of black ice collisions and snow machine wrecks. You spend 12 hours stabilizing fractured femurs and administering warm intravenous fluids to hunters who stayed out too long in the sub-zero temperatures. By the time the sun begins to drag itself over the Chugach Mountains at 8 in the morning, your body feels like lead. You operate on caffeine and muscle memory. I gathered my belongings from the staff locker room. I wrapped my thick woolen scarf around my neck and walked out the sliding glass doors toward the employee parking structure. The winter air hit my lungs like shattered glass. It was -10 degrees. The sky was still a bruised purple, and the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes. The employee parking lot was a sprawling concrete structure designed to keep our vehicles clear of the snowplows. I walked to the 3rd level. The concrete echoed with the sound of my boots. My car was parked near the edge under a flickering yellow sodium lamp. As I reached for my car keys, a shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar blocking my path to the driver's side door. My heart spiked with a sudden rush of adrenaline. In my line of work, you learn to scan for threats instantly. I gripped my keys, preparing to defend myself. But as the figure stepped under the yellow light, the threat profile shifted from physical danger to a pathetic reality. It was my father, David. I stood frozen in the snow, assessing the man standing in front of me. He did not look like the proud patriarch who used to dictate the rules of our household. He did not look like the arrogant investor who ordered rounds of margaritas on a Florida beach while his daughter was fighting sepsis. He looked sloppy. He was wearing a thin jacket that was not rated for the Alaskan winter. His shoulders were hunched against the biting wind. His face was unshaven and drawn tight with exhaustion. The failure of Lexi's wedding and the resulting social humiliation had aged him a decade in a matter of weeks. He held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. He told me not to run away. He said he had been waiting in the freezing concrete structure for 3 hours just to catch me after my shift. He knew the legal barriers I had erected. He knew my lawyers would press charges if he tried to contact me through digital channels or at my home. So he resorted to lurking in the shadows of my workplace. I did not reach for my phone to call hospital security. I did not feel threatened by him anymore. I felt a cold clinical detachment. I looked at him the same way I look at a patient who ignored every medical warning and is now surprised by their own terminal diagnosis. I asked him what he wanted. David dropped the authoritative tone he had used my entire life. He did not try to lecture me. He did not try to gaslight me about the Miami trip. The desperation had stripped away his ego, leaving only raw panic. He told me the bank was moving forward with the foreclosure on his house. The balloon payment on the mortgage was past due. The creditors from Lex's failed boutique were garnishing his remaining accounts. He said he was drowning. He lowered his head and begged his estranged daughter for a $30,000 loan to stop the bank from seizing the property. $30,000. He said the number so casually, as if it were a simple favor between friends. I stood in the freezing wind and let his request hang in the air. I thought about the sheer audacity required to ask me for money after attempting to strip away my legal rights in a probate court. I thought about the extortion attempt Travis had tried to pull just days prior. My father was standing in front of the very person he had tried to destroy, and he was asking for a lifeline. I did not yell. I did not cry. I looked at the snow collecting on his shoulders and began to recite the cold arithmetic of his choices. I told him to listen closely because I was only going to explain the math to him once. I reminded him of the $60,000 he handed Lexi for a boutique that sold overpriced candles before crashing into bankruptcy. I reminded him of the $45,000 auto loan he co-signed so his favorite daughter could drive a luxury vehicle while I stood shivering at a city transit stop. I brought up the $20,000 catering deposit for a wedding that no longer existed. I calculated the cost of the first-class tickets to Miami. I laid out the ledger of their financial ruin item by item. I told him that $30,000 was not a loan, it was a temporary bandage on an amputated limb. I explained that I was a trauma nurse. My job was to triage emergencies and allocate resources to patients who had a chance of survival. I told him his financial situation was a code blue, and I was declining to resuscitate. He stepped closer. His voice cracked as he pleaded with me. He said they were family. He said they were going to be homeless. He tried to invoke the sacred bond of blood. I looked him dead in the eye. I delivered the hardest truth he would ever hear. Narcissism is not just an attitude, David. It is a financial contagion. It infects everything it touches until the host is bled dry. You chose your investment. You poured every ounce of your wealth, your energy, and your loyalty into Lexi. You treated me like a disposable utility. Now the market has crashed. You chose your investment, and now you have to live with the returns. He stood there paralyzed by the finality of my words. He had no defense. He had no counter-argument. The illusion he had built his entire life upon was shattered on the frozen concrete of the hospital parking lot. He realized in that moment that his quiet, reliable daughter was never coming back to save him. I walked past him. I pressed the button on my key fob, and the car unlocked with a sharp chirp. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life. The heater kicked on, pushing warm air into the freezing cabin. I pulled the door shut and locked it. The heavy thud of the locks engaging felt like the closing of a vault. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I checked my rearview mirror as I drove toward the exit ramp. David was still standing in the empty parking space, entirely alone in the icy dawn. He was a ruined man watching his salvation drive away. But a family built on manipulation does not surrender gracefully. David had failed using legal threats. Travis had failed using extortion. David had failed by begging. They were out of money and out of leverage. This left my mother, Susan. Susan could not use the law and she could not write a check. But she had spent decades cultivating a very specific type of power within the Anchorage community. She had one weapon left in her arsenal. She was preparing to use her social standing and her church to wage a holy war against me. David returned to their rented apartment with nothing but the cold reality of his failure. He had stood in the frozen parking lot and watched his salvation drive away. When he told Susan that the direct financial route was dead, she did not accept defeat. Narcissists do not surrender, they simply change the battlefield. Susan realized she could not manipulate me directly, and she could not use her husband to intimidate me. She decided to pivot to the only arena where she still held any influence. She was going to wage a holy war against me using the sanctuary of Grace Community Fellowship. Grace Community Fellowship was an affluent, tight-knit congregation nestled in the upscale neighborhoods of South Anchorage. It featured soaring vaulted ceilings, imported stained glass, and a congregation filled with local politicians, business owners, and prominent medical professionals. For over 2 decades, Susan had used that building as her personal stage. She had spent years cultivating a pristine reputation within those walls. She was the woman who organized the winter coat drives for the homeless. She was the first person to deliver a baked casserole when a member of the congregation passed away. It was a carefully constructed mask of piety and grace designed to make her look untouchable. Growing up, I watched her use that church to parade Lexi around like a prize-winning show horse. Susan would dress Lexi in expensive boutique dresses and push her to the front of the children's choir, ensuring everyone saw her beautiful golden child. I was the kid who sat quietly in the pew, holding their winter coats and remaining invisible. Susan built her entire public identity on being perceived as the perfect, loving Alaskan matriarch. With the bank closing in on their foreclosure, Susan deployed her tears like tactical weapons. She targeted the Ladies' Auxiliary. The auxiliary was a group of wealthy, influential women who dictated the social hierarchy of the entire congregation. Whoever controlled the auxiliary controlled the narrative of the church. Susan began attending their Wednesday morning meetings with a specific agenda. She sat in the church parlor sipping tea and weeping softly into a linen handkerchief. She spun a tragic and compelling tale for the other women. She claimed her youngest daughter had been corrupted by a sudden, unexpected inheritance. She painted herself as a heartbroken mother who had sacrificed everything for her children only to be tossed aside. She implied that I was hoarding my grandfather's wealth while my parents faced imminent eviction. She never mentioned the trip to Miami. She never mentioned the intensive care unit. She only spoke of my profound cruelty and her own endless suffering. The whisper campaign worked exactly as she intended. The murmurs spread through the congregation and eventually seeped out into the broader Anchorage community. A few of the older nurses at my hospital who attended the fellowship gave me strange, disapproving looks in the break room. Susan was trying to squeeze me from the outside in. She believed the weight of community disapproval would eventually break my resolve and force me to surrender the Matanuska property just to save my local reputation. But Susan made a fatal tactical error. She was so focused on destroying my character that she forgot about the silent architect of my survival. She forgot about my grandmother. Evelyn Carter did not just attend Grace Community Fellowship, she was a charter member. 40 years ago, Evelyn and my grandfather Arthur donated the seed money to build the new fellowship hall. Evelyn sat on the board of elders. She did not seek attention, and she did not participate in the Wednesday morning gossip circles. She commanded a quiet, unshakable respect from every single person in that building. She sat in the third row every Sunday, observing everything and saying very little. It happened on the first Sunday of the month. The morning service had just concluded, and the congregation moved into the fellowship hall for coffee and pastries. The room was packed with over 300 people. The sound of clinking porcelain and overlapping conversations echoed off the high ceilings. Susan was holding court near the refreshment table. She wore a modest floral dress and a pair of pearl earrings. She was dabbing her eyes with a tissue surrounded by 5 prominent women from the auxiliary. They were leaning in, offering their sympathies and shaking their heads at the tragic story of her ungrateful daughter. Susan was bathing in the validation. She was the star of her own tragedy. Evelyn stood up from her table near the back of the hall. She smoothed the front of her wool skirt and picked up her leather purse. She walked across the linoleum floor with a slow, deliberate pace. The crowd parted for her instinctively. I was not there to see it, but Jess's mother was standing just a few feet away, and she recounted every second of the execution to me later that afternoon. Evelyn stopped 3 feet from Susan. The women surrounding my mother quieted down instantly, offering respectful smiles to the elder. Evelyn did not smile back. She looked directly at her daughter-in-law. The temperature in that corner of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Susan tried to maintain her performance. She offered a wavering smile and reached out to touch Evelyn's arm. Evelyn stepped back, refusing the contact. Evelyn asked Susan how the weather was in Florida. Susan froze. Her hand hovered in the empty air. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She used the natural acoustics of the large hall to carry her words to the surrounding tables. She noted that Susan had a remarkable tan for an Alaskan winter. Then Evelyn delivered the timeline. She spoke with the cold precision of a court reporter. She stated that Susan and David boarded a commercial flight to Miami on a Saturday morning. She stated that I collapsed from sepsis on a graduation stage 4 hours later. She detailed how Susan posted photos of frozen margaritas on a sunny beach while I was connected to a ventilator fighting a systemic infection. The women from the auxiliary stared at Susan in stunned silence. Susan stammered, attempting to form an excuse. She tried to say it was a misunderstanding and that they did not know I was sick. Evelyn cut her off. She reached into her leather purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the public court docket record of the dismissed conservatorship petition. Evelyn handed the document directly to the head of the auxiliary. Evelyn explained that when David and Susan finally returned to Anchorage, they did not drive to the hospital to pray for my recovery. They drove to a strip mall to hire a lawyer. She explained that they attempted to declare me legally incompetent so they could raid my trust fund while I was in a medical coma. Evelyn did not yell. She did not call Susan names. She simply laid out the chronological facts and let the undeniable truth do the heavy lifting. The document was passed from hand to hand among the auxiliary members. The proof was staring them in the face. Susan had used their empathy to cover up her own depravity. Evelyn looked at Susan one last time. She told Susan she had disgraced the family name long enough. Then Evelyn turned around and walked out of the fellowship hall, leaving Susan trapped in the center of the room. The reaction from this congregation was swift and merciless. Church communities despise hypocrisy above all else. They can forgive a mistake, but they will not tolerate being manipulated by a predator wearing a mask of piety. The women who had been comforting Susan took a collective step back. The physical distance between them grew. People turned their heads, avoiding eye contact. The ambient noise of the hall returned, but the conversations were now entirely focused on the revelation. Susan was left standing completely alone next to the coffee urn. Her carefully cultivated image evaporated into thin air. The narrative of the perfect, loving matriarch was incinerated in less than 3 minutes. Over the next few weeks, the isolation became permanent. Susan was no longer asked to lead the prayer circles. Her name was quietly removed from the charity luncheon invitations. When she walked into the sanctuary on Sunday mornings, the people sitting in her usual row shifted away. She was relegated to the very back pew, sitting in a suffocating silence of her own making. The church had been her kingdom, and she had been exiled within its walls. David had failed in the frozen parking lot. Susan had failed in the fellowship hall. They had no money, no social standing, and no legal leverage to access the Matanuska timberland. The bank foreclosure on their home was only days away. When people like my parents run out of legitimate options, they do not reflect on their mistakes and ask for forgiveness. They double down. Having exhausted every legal and social avenue, they decided the law no longer applied to them. They realized they could not take my money, so they decided to take my identity. They were about to cross a line that would force me to choose between sending them to federal prison or losing everything I had built. The fallout from the church left David and Susan with 0 local allies. The bank was no longer returning their phone calls. The auction date for their home was officially printed in the public notices section of the Anchorage newspaper. They were out of time and out of options. When cornered individuals run out of legitimate avenues, they do not suddenly develop a moral compass. They abandon the rules entirely. Having failed to manipulate the law and the community, they decided to cross a boundary that shifted their actions from family drama to a federal crime. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen island in my townhouse. I was drinking a cup of green tea and reviewing medical journals before my upcoming evening shift at the hospital. The snow outside my window was falling in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. My phone chimed, resting on the granite counter. It was not a standard text message. It was a high-priority alert from the Elite Identity Protection Agency my fiduciary had attached to my financial portfolio. I opened the secure application. The dashboard displayed 3 distinct credit inquiries executed within the past 10 minutes. Someone had just applied for a $50,000 unsecured personal loan through a major national bank. A second application was filed for a premium tier credit card with a substantial spending limit. A third inquiry was logged at a local Alaskan credit union for an auto loan. I set my teacup down. I stared at the digital alerts. The name on all three applications was Sarah Carter. Identity theft committed by a stranger is a random act of opportunity. Identity theft committed by your own parents is a deeply intimate violation. It is a unique kind of betrayal because the thief is the very person who established your identity in the first place. To understand how they managed this, you have to look at the administrative control parents hold over a child. Growing up, Susan kept a locked gray metal filing cabinet in the hallway of our house. It contained birth certificates, old tax returns, and medical records. I had secured my physical Social Security card when I moved out, but Susan possessed a photographic memory for numbers. She had memorized my 9-digit Social Security number when I was a teenager, applying for my first job at a grocery store. She knew my mother's maiden name because it was her own. She knew the street I grew up on. She held the answers to every standard security question a bank could possibly ask. Since the Timberland Trust had vested and my nursing salary had stabilized, my credit rating had climbed into the top percentile. I had an immaculate financial profile. David and Susan wanted to hijack that pristine score. They intended to use my name to secure the cash required to halt their foreclosure. If the banks approved those loans, the funds would be deposited into an account they controlled. They would take the cash and leave me holding the bag for tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent debt. The stakes were much higher than a ruined credit score. A trauma nursing license requires strict background checks and financial audits. Defaulting on massive unexplained loans could trigger an ethics review by the state medical board. My parents were willing to detonate my entire professional career just to buy themselves a few more months in a house they could not afford. They viewed my identity as a resource they were entitled to extract. I did not call them to ask why. I did not text Lexi to see if she was involved. I opened the credit monitoring application and locked my Social Security number across all three major bureaus with a single tap on the screen. The pending applications were instantly frozen. Then I called Mr. Caldwell, my estate fiduciary. I explained the alerts. He told me to put my coat on and drive directly to a specific address in downtown Anchorage. An hour later, I was sitting in the office of Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a specialized corporate litigator who dealt in white-collar crime and aggressive civil defense. His office was located on the top floor of a sleek glass building overlooking the frozen inlet. The room was cold, sparse, and designed for pure efficiency. Marcus sat behind his heavy oak desk, reviewing the flagged applications on his computer monitor. He possessed a calm, surgical demeanor. He made a few phone calls to his contacts at the fraud departments of the respective banks. Within 20 minutes, he had extracted the data we needed. He printed a single sheet of paper and slid it across the desk toward me. The document showed the digital footprints of the fraudulent applications. The Internet protocol addresses logged by the banks matched the exact routing network assigned to my parents' rented apartment. It was undeniable proof of origin. Marcus folded his hands together. He looked at me with assessing eyes. He stated that we had a choice to make. We could simply leave the credit freeze in place and treat the incident as a blocked attempt, or we could escalate. Escalation meant treating David and Susan not as misguided family members, but as hostile criminal actors. I sat in the leather chair and looked at the printed IP addresses. The silence in the law office felt heavy. For the first time since my graduation, a familiar ghost entered the room. It was the ghost of the people-pleasing girl I used to be. The girl who scrubbed floors and handed over her savings to keep the peace. The ghost whispered in my ear, telling me to let it go. It argued that sending my own parents into the crosshairs of federal law enforcement was an unforgivable sin. Society conditions us to protect our family regardless of their sins. We are taught to absorb the blows to keep the family unit intact. The ghost told me that if I dropped the hammer, I would be just as cold and ruthless as they were. It is a terrifying moment when you realize the people who gave you life are willing to destroy your future to save themselves. The biological instinct to protect your parents wars with the logical instinct to survive. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. I thought about the ghost. Then I thought about the reality. I remembered the empty chairs in the third row of the auditorium. I remembered the burning pain of sepsis spreading through my abdomen while they drank margaritas on a sunny beach. I remembered the smirk on Travis' face when he tried to extort me for wedding funds. I remembered my father begging for cash in the freezing parking lot, expecting me to bail him out of his own poor choices. They had never protected me. They had only ever harvested me. If I let this go, they would perceive my mercy as weakness. They would simply wait for me to look away, and they would try again. They would never stop trying to break through my walls until there was nothing left of me. The ghost of the glass child vanished. My sympathy flatlined. I opened my eyes and looked across the desk at Marcus Thorne. I reached for the printed paper showing their digital footprint and handed it back to him. I told him I did not want to leave the credit freeze as a passive defense. I told him I wanted to go on the offensive. I instructed Marcus to draft the most severe legal response his firm could produce. I wanted to build a paper trail that would insulate me from their actions forever. I was ready to show David and Susan that the daughter they had treated like a doormat for 2 decades had built an impenetrable fortress. They had chosen to play a criminal game, and I was going to ensure they faced the ultimate consequence. I was about to introduce my parents to the crushing weight of the justice system. I sat across from Marcus Thorne and gave him the authorization to proceed. The decision did not feel like vengeance. It felt like basic hygiene. I was cutting out a rot that had threatened to infect my entire life. Marcus nodded and turned toward his computer. He did not offer any false sympathy or question my loyalty to my family. He was a professional hired to protect an asset, and right now I was the asset. He typed out a brief summary of the digital evidence and printed a hard copy of the Internet Protocol logs traced directly to my parents' rented apartment. He placed the documents into a manila folder and handed it across the desk. Marcus told me the law firm could handle the civil injunctions, but the criminal aspect required my physical presence. If I wanted to insulate my nursing license and my financial portfolio from their fraudulent applications, I had to go on the record with law enforcement. I took the folder and left the glass building. I drove my car through the snowy streets of downtown Anchorage, heading straight for the police department headquarters on 4th Avenue. The sky was overcast, and the city was quiet. I parked in the visitor lot and walked up the concrete steps. The air inside the precinct smelled of floor wax and damp wool. The lighting was harsh and unapologetic. I approached the front desk and waited for the duty officer to finish typing on his terminal. When he looked up, I handed him the manila folder. I told him I needed to file a formal report for felony identity theft and attempted wire fraud. The officer asked for the name of the suspect. I looked him in the eye and gave him the names of my mother and my father. He paused for a fraction of a second. Law enforcement officers see the dark side of human nature every day, but there is always a brief moment of hesitation when a child turns in their parents. He took the folder and asked me to sit in a small interview room down the hall. Sitting in that windowless room, I thought about how my mother used to view the law. When Lexi and I were children, Susan used the threat of police intervention as a weapon to bully our neighbors. If a neighbor parked too close to our driveway, or if their dog barked too loud, Susan would stand on the porch and dial the non-emergency dispatch line just to prove she held the power. She loved leveraging authority to make other people feel small. She operated under the delusion that the rules existed to serve her and punish everyone else. A detective assigned to the Financial Crimes Division walked into the room. He reviewed the documents Marcus had prepared. The paper trail was undeniable. The banks had flagged the applications. The credit monitoring service had locked the accounts. The digital footprints led straight to the device inside my parents' living room. The detective asked me a series of procedural questions. He asked how they obtained my social security number. I explained the locked filing cabinet from my childhood and my mother's photographic memory for numbers. The detective typed my statement into his laptop. He printed an official incident report and pushed it across the metal table for my signature. Taking the pen in my hand, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was the feeling of an invisible tether finally snapping. Society spends a lot of energy conditioning us to protect our parents regardless of their sins. We are taught to absorb the damage to keep the family unit intact. But signing that document severed the psychological umbilical cord that had tied me to their abuse for 2 decades. I signed my name in blue ink. The detective handed me a yellow card bearing the official case number. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow. I was the architect of my own defense. I drove back to the law office and handed the yellow card to Marcus. With the police report officially filed, Marcus unleashed the full capability of his firm. He drafted a cease and desist order that read like a declaration of war. It was not a polite request for distance. It was a terrifying legal ultimatum. The document cited specific sections of Title 18 of the United States Code regarding identity theft and federal wire fraud. It explicitly stated that law enforcement was already in possession of the digital evidence. Marcus included a strict no-contact directive. The parameters were suffocating. David and Susan were legally barred from contacting me by phone, email, or physical mail. The protection was extended to encompass Grandma Evelyn and my best friend Jess. If my parents attempted to run my credit again, if they showed up at my hospital, or if they approached my townhouse, the law firm would immediately forward the violation to the district attorney to pursue active felony warrants. We did not mail the documents. Marcus hired a licensed private process server to ensure the delivery was hand-to-hand and legally documented. The process server was a retired state trooper named Thomas. He drove an unmarked sedan to the neighborhood where my parents were currently staying. It was a bleak afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron and the wind was howling off the inlet. Thomas parked across the street and waited. The timing of the delivery was poetic. The bank deadline had passed. My childhood home was scheduled for the public auction block. David and Susan were in the humiliating process of moving the last of their belongings out of the house before the bank changed the locks. Thomas watched from his vehicle as David carried a taped cardboard box out the front door and shoved it into the back of a rented moving van. Susan followed close behind, carrying a stack of winter coats. They looked exhausted and defeated. The pristine image they had projected to the Anchorage community was gone. They were just 2 people facing the consequences of their own financial rot. Thomas stepped out of his sedan and walked up the driveway. The snow crunched under his heavy boots. He approached the moving van and called out their names. David and Susan Carter. David turned around, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He assumed Thomas was a neighbor or a representative from the bank. He confirmed his identity. Thomas reached inside his jacket and pulled out 2 thick manila envelopes. He handed one to David and one to Susan. He stated that they were officially served and stepped back to take a time-stamped photograph of them holding the documents. Thomas turned and walked back to his car, leaving them standing in the freezing driveway. David ripped open the envelope. I was not there to see his face, but I know exactly how white-collar criminals react when the illusion of their intelligence is shattered. David read the bold header on the legal stationery. Notification of intent to pursue felony charges. He read the official police report number. He read the federal statutes detailing the prison sentences for wire fraud. The color drained from his face. The remaining shreds of his arrogance evaporated into the freezing air. Susan looked over his shoulder and read the words federal prison. She dropped the winter coats onto the icy driveway. They realized in that exact moment that they had been entirely outmaneuvered. They thought they were dealing with the submissive, quiet girl who used to hand over her savings to keep the peace. They thought they could steal my identity and hide behind the shield of family loyalty. Instead, they collided with a concrete wall reinforced with steel. The threat of incarceration is the only language a narcissist truly respects. They do not care about breaking your heart. They do not care about destroying your peace, but they care deeply about their own survival. The realization that I was willing to send them to a federal holding cell broke their spirit permanently. They were stripped of their final ounce of unearned power. Sitting in my quiet, secure townhouse, I received a short email from Marcus. The message confirmed that the service was successfully executed. I locked my phone and set it on the granite counter. The boundary was built. The legal shield was active. My parents were neutralized and exiled to a cramped apartment on the outskirts of town. They had lost their social standing, their home, and their primary target. But the universe always balances its books, and the fallout from their failure was about to hit the one person who had benefited the most from their abuse. While David and Susan slinked away into obscurity, the golden child was left standing in the wreckage. Lexi had no wealthy fiancé. She had no boutique. And with our parents facing eviction, she no longer had a free place to live. The cold Alaskan winter was closing in, and my sister was rapidly running out of options. 6 months passed since the afternoon the process server handed the legal documents to my parents in their icy driveway. The rhythm of my new life settled into a steady, predictable cadence. I worked my designated shifts in the trauma unit. I met with my estate fiduciary to review the sustainable logging yields from the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. I spent my days off decorating my townhouse in South Addition, choosing heavy woolen rugs and solid oak furniture. I was building a life that felt grounded and secure. The silence from my family was a profound relief. The legal boundaries held firm, and for half a year I existed without looking over my shoulder. But closure is rarely a neat line drawn in the sand. Sometimes you have to see the physical evidence of the shifting tides to truly understand that the war is over. It was late November. The Alaskan twilight descends early, casting long gray shadows across the snow-packed streets of Anchorage by 3 in the afternoon. I was driving home from a routine dental appointment on the south side of town. The route took me within 2 miles of the neighborhood where I grew up. I had not driven down those specific streets since the day I moved out to start nursing school. A sudden, quiet impulse directed my hands on the steering wheel. I flipped my turn signal and took the detour. The neighborhood looked exactly as I remembered it. The houses were large 2-story structures with broad driveways and manicured evergreens. It was a subdivision built for professionals who wanted to project an image of effortless stability. I slowed my car to a crawl as I turned the final corner onto my old street. I pulled up to the curb across from my childhood house and put the car in park. I left the engine running, letting the heater blow warm air against my face. The property looked hollow. The driveway was empty and covered in a thick layer of undisturbed snow. There were no tire tracks leading to the garage. The windows were dark, and the heavy curtains my mother used to dry clean twice a year were gone, exposing the bare, empty rooms inside. Hammered deep into the frozen front lawn was a bright white and red sign. It bore the logo of a national bank and the word foreclosure printed in bold capital letters. I sat in my car and stared at the sign. I waited for a wave of nostalgia to hit me. I waited to feel a sense of loss for the place where I had spent the first 2 decades of my life. The nostalgia never came. It was extinguished instantly by the memory of the coldness inside those walls. That house was never a home. It was a curated museum dedicated to the golden child. I looked at the large bay window on the ground floor. Behind that window was the living room featuring a massive stone fireplace and a wide mahogany mantel. Susan used to polish that mantel every Sunday afternoon. It was the centerpiece of the room, and it belonged entirely to Lexi. Susan displayed every minor achievement Lexi ever stumbled into. There were framed photographs of Lexi in expensive boutique dresses. There were participation trophies from a brief stint in middle school cheerleading. There was a professionally mounted ribbon-cutting photo from the opening day of her failed retail business. The mantel was a shrine designed to constantly validate my sister. If a guest asked where my things were, Susan would wave a dismissive hand toward the dark, narrow hallway leading to the garage. In that hallway sat a heavy oak credenza. The bottom drawer was warped and always stuck when you tried to open it. That was where my life was stored. When I brought home the letter naming me valedictorian of my high school class, Susan folded it in half and shoved it into the sticking drawer. When I earned my state certification as an emergency medical technician, the certificate went straight into the dark wood. I spent my childhood opening that heavy drawer to look at my own accomplishments, hiding them away so my competence would not cast a shadow over my sister's fragility. Looking at the bank sign shivering in the winter wind, I realized the profound irony of their choices. They had sacrificed the very foundation of their lives to finance a fantasy. They remortgaged those walls to pay for Lexus inventory. They drained the equity to fund a tropical vacation, while ignoring the daughter, who could have easily paid off their debts if they had only treated her with basic human decency. The banking system does not care about your social standing. A mortgage lender does not care if you organize the winter coat drive at Grace Community Fellowship. The bank only recognizes the cold arithmetic of unpaid debts. David had spent months trying to stall the inevitable, but you cannot negotiate with a spreadsheet. The house had gone to public auction on the steps of the Anchorage courthouse 3 weeks prior. It was purchased by a property management firm holding a diverse real estate portfolio. My parents were formally evicted. They had to pack their curated lives into cheap cardboard boxes under the supervision of a county sheriff. Through the tight-knit grapevine of the local medical community, Jess heard where they had relocated. David and Susan were forced to rent a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in an aging complex on the far east side of town. It was a neighborhood where the heating pipes clanked through the night and the windows let in the bitter winter drafts. They had no space for their heavy oak credenza. They had no mahogany mantel to display their pride. They had lost their square footage and their status. I put my car in gear and pulled away from the curb. I watched the foreclosure sign shrink in my rearview mirror until I turned the corner and the house was gone. I felt a deep, settling peace in my chest. The universe operates on a fundamental law of equilibrium. It balances its books eventually. The ledger of injustice I had carried on my shoulders for over 2 decades was permanently zeroed out. My parents had chosen to invest everything into a hollow asset, and they were now living with the returns of their bankruptcy. I owed them nothing. The equation was resolved. But a balanced equation assumes all the variables except the new reality. David and Susan were broken and exhausted, but they were not the only parasitic elements in my family tree. Lexi was a creature built entirely on unearned privilege. She had spent her life absorbing resources without ever facing a consequence. When Travis discovered the truth and broke the engagement, he did not just humiliate her, he stranded her. Lexi had no boutique to run and no wealthy fiancé to finance her aesthetic lifestyle. For the first few months after the wedding collapsed, Lexi tried to maintain her illusion. She slept on the couches of her various friends, spinning stories about how she had dumped Travis because he lacked ambition. But her friends were not blind. They saw the foreclosure notices. They heard the church gossip. One by one, they stopped returning her calls. They asked her to move out. They realized she was a financial drain who refused to seek actual employment. Lexi was forced to move into the cramped 2-bedroom apartment with our disgraced parents. For the golden child, sharing a small, damp space with 2 defeated adults was a fate worse than death. Lexi refused to sleep on a futon in a low-income rental. She refused to apply for entry-level jobs at the local grocery stores. She believed she was destined for a luxury lifestyle, and she believed someone else was supposed to pay the admission fee. She knew our parents were tapped out. She knew her friends were gone. She knew she had no legal leverage. But desperation breeds a very specific type of delusion. Lexi convinced herself that the rules of the New World Order did not apply to her. She convinced herself that because we shared the same blood, I would eventually fold if she just pushed hard enough. She spent weeks using fake social media profiles to monitor my inner circle. She could not track me directly, but she managed to manipulate a mutual acquaintance who worked in the hospital billing department. Under the guise of wanting to send me an apology letter, Lexi obtained the private address to my secure townhouse in South Addition. I thought the war was over because I had neutralized the generals. I forgot that the most dangerous combatant is the one who has absolutely nothing left to lose. I drove back to my secure neighborhood, unaware that the final confrontation was already in motion. Lexi was not bringing lawyers or forged documents. She was bringing the sheer, unadulterated entitlement of a sibling who fully believed I existed only to serve her. The final ghost of my past was walking directly to my doorstep. The winter wind coming off the Cook Inlet carries a specific type of warning. It rattles the window panes and strips the remaining heat from the pavement. Inside my townhouse in the South Addition neighborhood, the elements were entirely locked out. It was a Friday evening. The radiant floor heating kept the hardwood warm under my bare feet. The air smelled of roasted garlic and fresh rosemary. Jess stood at the kitchen island chopping vegetables while Grandma Evelyn sat at the dining table holding a steaming mug of tea. The ambient sound of their quiet laughter filled the high ceilings. I was pouring a glass of water, feeling the profound security of a life I had built from the ground up. Then the heavy silence of the neighborhood was broken. A sharp, relentless pounding echoed through the front hallway. It was not a polite tap. It was an entitled, demanding strike against the thick oak wood of my front door. The person on the other side was hitting the commercial-grade deadbolt with a closed fist. I set my glass down on the granite counter. Jess stopped chopping. Evelyn lowered her tea. The laughter died instantly. I walked down the short corridor to the entryway and pulled up the live feed on my security tablet. The night vision camera illuminated the front porch in stark black and white contrast. Standing under the glow of the motion sensor light was my older sister. Lexi looked nothing like the woman who used to post flawless tropical vacation photos. She was shivering in a thin designer wool coat that she clearly could not afford to dry clean anymore. Her shoulders were hunched against the biting wind. Her hair was tangled and her face was pale. She was stamping her boots on the concrete, trying to generate warmth. To understand why she was standing on my porch, you have to understand the defining trait of her entire existence. Lexi never learned how to wait in the cold. Whenever she faced a minor inconvenience, my parents immediately built a fire to keep her warm. Whenever she encountered a locked door, they kicked it down for her. She had spent her entire life walking through portals that other people had forced open. She assumed my front door was just another threshold she could cross without consequence. She believed the rules of the new reality did not apply to her. I placed my hand on the brass handle of the deadbolt. I knew this confrontation was inevitable. A parasite does not detach simply because you ask it to leave. It holds on until it realizes the host is no longer viable. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. The freezing Alaskan air rushed into the warm hallway, carrying a dusting of dry snow. Lexi took an immediate step forward, intending to push her way inside the house. I shifted my weight and planted myself directly in the center of the threshold, blocking her path. I did not invite her in. She stopped short. She wrapped her arms around her chest and looked past my shoulder at the glowing warmth of the living room. "Sarah, let me in," she said. Her voice was shaking from the cold, but the undertone of her signature entitlement was still present. "It is freezing out here. You have to let me stay with you. Mom and Dad's new apartment is a nightmare. The heating is broken and I am sleeping on a terrible futon." She did not ask how I was doing. She did not apologize for the smear campaign she tried to run against me on social media. She did not mention the extortion attempt her former fiancé executed in a diner parking lot. She simply recited her list of grievances and expected me to provide the solution. I stood in the doorway looking at the woman who had tormented me for 2 decades. I felt no anger. I felt no pity. I felt a clinical detachment identical to the focus I use when assessing a severe triage patient. I looked at her frostbitten cheeks and her desperate eyes. "I am not letting you inside, Lexi," I said. My voice was low and steady. She blinked as if I had spoken a foreign language. Her face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. "We are sisters," she snapped. "You have a huge house with empty bedrooms. You have all that trust fund money. You owe me a place to sleep. You cannot just leave your own flesh and blood standing out in the snow." The old version of me would have crumbled under the weight of that guilt trip. I would have stepped aside and let her bring her chaos into my sanctuary. I would have offered her a hot meal and a warm bed, hoping my generosity would finally earn her respect. But the girl who used to crave her approval died on a graduation stage. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a screaming match on the front porch for the neighbors to hear. I simply turned around and reached for a manila folder resting on the entryway console table. I had printed the documents inside weeks ago, anticipating the day she would finally exhaust her options and track me down. I turned back to the freezing threshold and handed the folder to my sister. Lexi took it instinctively. She opened the cover and squinted at the crisp white papers inside. "What is this?" she asked. "It is an application for a certified nursing assistant training program," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "The hospital down the street is experiencing a severe staffing shortage. They will pay you a training wage while you learn how to take patient vitals, change soiled bed linens, and assist the elderly with basic hygiene. It is hard physical labor. It pays $20 an hour." Lexi stared at the application. Her mouth fell open in sheer disbelief. The idea of wearing scrubs and performing manual labor was a direct insult to her manufactured identity. "Behind the application," I continued, "is a printed list of income-restricted housing units in the Anchorage municipal area. They all have long wait lists. You will need to stand in line at the Housing Authority office, fill out a stack of financial disclosure forms, and prove you are actively seeking employment to qualify for a subsidized studio apartment." Lexi looked up from the folder. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and rising fury. "You want me to wipe down hospital beds?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You want me to live in government housing while you sit in a luxury townhouse?" I nodded slowly. "I want you to join the real world, Lexi. I want you to understand what it takes to build a life when no one is handing you a blank check." She gripped the edges of the folder. Her knuckles turned white. She prepared to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse. She opened her mouth to scream at me, to call me every terrible name our mother had ever invented. But before she could speak, a floorboard creaked in the hallway behind me. Jess stepped into the light of the entryway. She crossed her arms over her chest and stared at Lexi with a gaze as hard as flint. A moment later, Grandma Evelyn appeared, standing shoulder to shoulder with Jess. Evelyn did not say a word. She just looked at Lexi with the same cold finality she had used to banish our mother from the church fellowship hall. Lexi looked at the three of us standing together. We formed a solid, impenetrable wall holding the perimeter of my home. Lexi saw the warmth, the loyalty, and the quiet strength radiating from the hallway. She realized she was entirely outnumbered. She was staring at a family unit that was built on mutual respect and shared survival. It was a language she did not speak. I took a step forward, closing the final gap between us. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered my final verdict. "I will not fund your delusions, Lexi," I said, "but I will show you how to work. That is all I have for you." Lexi stood on the porch waiting for the punchline. She waited for my resolve to break. She waited for me to sigh, open the door wider, and tell her to come inside out of the cold. The silence stretched into a long, agonizing minute. The wind howled through the spruce trees above our heads. The fold never came. The realization finally hit her. She saw the concrete boundary I had poured around my life, and she knew she lacked the strength to break it down. Her unearned kingdom was gone, and the Bank of Sarah was closed forever. Lexi looked down at the folder in her hands. With a sudden, bitter motion, she crushed the papers into a tight ball. She threw the crumpled application onto the snow-covered welcome mat. She turned her back to the warm light of my home and walked down the concrete steps. I watched her figure shrink into the darkness of the Anchorage winter, pulling her thin coat tight against the biting wind. I reached down and picked up the crumpled paper. I stepped backward into my hallway and pushed the heavy oak door shut. I engaged the commercial deadbolt. The metal locks clicked into place with a loud, satisfying finality, sealing the cold outside. I walked back into the kitchen. Jess and Evelyn returned to the dining table, picking up their conversation right where they had left off. The tension evaporated instantly, replaced by the aroma of the roasting dinner. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the house grew quiet, I sat alone in an armchair by the fireplace. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving a profound psychological clarity in its wake. Watching Lexi walk away into the snow forced me to examine the true nature of the people who had raised us. I needed to dissect the mechanics of their dysfunction to ensure I never repeated their mistakes. I began to understand the clinical reality of narcissistic projection and the dangerous survival mechanism of people-pleasing that had nearly cost me my life. The wood popped and hissed in the hearth of my living room. I stood in the hallway for a long time after the deadbolt clicked into place. I listened to the sound of my sister's boots crunching against the snow. until the noise faded into the howling wind off the Cook Inlet. The adrenaline that had spiked during the confrontation slowly receded. It drained from my shoulders and left my muscles heavy. I walked back into the kitchen where the warmth of the radiant floor heating grounded me in the present moment. Jess was wiping down the granite countertops. Grandma Evelyn was sitting in the leather armchair near the fireplace holding her ceramic mug. The house was secure. The perimeter was sealed. Evelyn watched me walk into the room. She placed her mug on the side table. She reached into her structured leather handbag resting on the floor beside her chair. She pulled out a small black notebook bound in worn leather. She held the notebook out to me. Her eyes were dark and reflective, reflecting the orange glow of the fire. "Your grandfather gave this to me 5 years ago," Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the high ceilings of the townhouse. "He told me to keep it locked in a safe deposit box. He explicitly instructed me to hand it to you only when the war was over. He said you needed to survive the storm before you could understand the weather." I took the notebook from her hands. The leather was soft and creased with age. I sat down on the sofa across from her and opened the cover. The pages were filled with my grandfather Arthur's neat angular handwriting. It was not a legal ledger. It was not a blueprint for the Matanuska Valley Timberland Trust. It was an observational journal. Arthur had spent the last years of his life documenting the psychological mechanics of our family. He had watched the rot spread, and he wanted to leave me a map to understand the battlefield I was destined to inherit. I turned the pages and began to read the history of the woman who gave birth to me. To understand the cruelty of my mother, you have to look at the soil she grew up in. Susan was not born into the effortless wealth she projected to the Anchorage community. Arthur documented her origins with stark clarity. Susan was raised in a dilapidated trailer park on the outskirts of Fairbanks. She grew up with a father who drank away his paychecks and a mother who disappeared for weeks at a time. Susan spent her formative years trapped in an environment defined by profound scarcity and instability. When she met my father David, she did not see a partner. She saw a life raft. David came from the respected Carter family line. He represented status security and the illusion of safety. Susan married him to escape her reality. But Arthur noted a fatal flaw in her survival strategy. Susan never developed her own identity. She never pursued an education. She never learned how to generate her own income or stand on her own 2 feet. She traded her independence for a gilded cage. She lived her entire adult life in quiet terror. She was terrified that the Anchorage high society would discover her roots. She was terrified that David would realize she brought nothing to the table. She operated from a place of deep, hollow insecurity. Arthur broke down the psychology of how that insecurity poisoned her parenting. When Lexi was born, Susan saw a mirror. Lexi was demanding, fragile, and entirely dependent. Lexi's inability to function without assistance made Susan feel indispensable. By coddling Lexi and funding her every whim, Susan validated her own worth. She created a dynamic where she was the savior and Lexi was the helpless subject. Then I was born. I was the exact opposite of my sister. From a very young age, I demonstrated an innate grit. I solved my own problems. I earned my own money. I pushed myself through grueling nursing shifts to secure my own future. Arthur wrote that my independence was a direct threat to my mother's fragile ego. Every time I achieved a milestone, I reminded Susan of her own lack of substance. My work ethic highlighted her laziness. My self-reliance highlighted her dependency. She could not control me with money because I did not need her money. She resented me because I represented the resilience she desperately lacked. She propped up Lexi to soothe her own anxiety, and she tore me down to neutralize the threat I posed to her manufactured reality. This is the clinical definition of narcissistic projection. She projected her own feelings of inadequacy onto me, painting me as the difficult child, so she would not have to face her own reflections. I closed the small leather notebook and rested it on my lap. The flames danced in the fireplace, casting warm light over the quiet room. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating precision. The demystification of my mother stripped away the last lingering shadows of my childhood. Susan was not a calculating mastermind plotting my demise. She was a wounded, hollow person who never sought healing for her own trauma. She weaponized her children to stabilize her own fractured mind. Recognizing this fact did not excuse the abuse. It did not erase the frozen bus stops or the unpaid tuition bills, but it dissolved the power she held over me. You cannot fear a ghost once you turn on the lights and see the machinery operating the haunting. I leaned back against the sofa cushions and examined my own role in the dynamic. For 2 decades, I was trapped in a relentless cycle of people-pleasing. I believed that if I just worked harder, sacrificed more, and proved my utility, my parents would eventually grant me a seat at their table. Breaking a trauma bond is a brutal physiological process. It is not just a mental decision. It feels like dying. The human brain is hardwired by evolution to seek the approval of the pack leaders for basic survival. When you decide to sever that cord, your nervous system reacts as if you are stepping off a cliff. During the first few weeks of my information diet, my body experienced actual withdrawal symptoms. My chest would tighten, my hands would shake. A quiet voice in my head would scream that I was making a fatal mistake. I would lie awake at night wondering if I was the villain they claimed me to be. That is why the medical emergency at my graduation was the ultimate catalyst. The sepsis that nearly killed me was the antidote to my conditioning. When the bacteria flooded my bloodstream and the stage lights faded to black, I hit the absolute bottom of human endurance. The physical death of my body mirrored the death of my illusion. If my appendix had not ruptured, I would have driven to that celebratory dinner. I would have sat across from my parents and listened to their false praise. I would have taken the pen and signed the quitclaim deed handing over my grandfather's timberland just to secure a fake smile from my mother. The illness saved my life. It shattered the mirage. Waking up in the intensive care unit and looking at the photo of their frozen margaritas provided the undeniable proof my brain needed to break the programming. It forced me to stop performing for empty chairs. It showed me the stark reality of my worth in their eyes. I looked across the living room. Jess was placing the clean dishes into the cabinets. She had spent the last 2 years running interference for me, standing between me and the wreckage of my past. I looked at Evelyn. She had stood in a hospital lobby and faced down a predatory lawyer to protect my future. True family is not determined by a shared last name. It is not dictated by matching genetics or historical obligation. True family is determined by the people who are sitting next to your hospital bed when you wake up from the anesthesia. It is defined by the individuals who hold the perimeter when the wolves arrive at your door. The external war was definitively over. My parents were facing eviction in a rundown apartment. Lexi was walking through the snow without $1 to her name. Travis was disgraced and banished to the Kenai Peninsula. The smear campaigns were silenced, and the legal boundaries were set in concrete. But survival is only the initial phase of the journey. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a profound quiet in its place. I sat in the warmth of my home and realized that a new, more complex conflict was emerging. Holding $1 million commercial asset and earning a premier medical salary requires a deliberate purpose. Wealth is an amplifier. It magnifies the character of the person wielding it. If I simply hoarded the logging dividends from the Matanuska Valley, I would become another cold, isolated branch on the Carter family tree. I would fall into the same trap of materialism that destroyed my parents. I stared into the burning embers of the hearth. I knew I had to break the generational curse. Permanently, the Matanuska Valley timberland could not just be a shield to hide behind. It had to become a weapon for good. I had secured my perimeter and healed my wounds. Now I had to figure out how to leverage my grandfather's gift to ensure the cycle of abuse ended with me. I had one final score to settle with my legacy, and it would require stepping back into the light of the Anchorage community. 2 years have passed since the winter my old life burned to the ground. The Alaskan spring is currently forcing a thaw over the Chugach Mountains. The ice is melting, and the city of Anchorage is waking up. I am 24 years old. I stand in the center of Trauma Bay 4 at Providence, Alaska Medical Center. The room is a symphony of controlled chaos, A patient just arrived via medevac helicopter. He is a backcountry skier suffering from profound hypothermia and a complex femoral fracture. The monitors beep in a rapid, erratic rhythm. The junior residents are hesitating, unsure of which intervention to prioritize. I do not hesitate. As the lead trauma nurse, I dictate the pace of the room. I order the residents to secure the airway while I initiate the rapid infusion of warmed intravenous fluids. I stabilize the fractured limb and administer the precise dosage of pain management medication. Within 12 minutes, the patient's core temperature begins to rise. The erratic beeping settles into a steady, reassuring pulse. The attending physician steps back and gives me a silent nod of respect. I built my clinical reputation on these high-stakes moments. I earned my title through grit and flawless execution. My career is an ironclad fortress that nobody can ever take away from me. But achieving professional success was only half of the equation. Earning a premier medical salary and holding the Matanuska Valley Timberland Trust required a deliberate purpose. The logging dividends had generated a substantial surplus over the past 24 months. My fiduciary, Mr. Caldwell, advised me to reinvest the capital into index funds to maximize my personal yield. I declined his advice. Storing wealth simply to watch the numbers grow felt hollow. I wanted to build a mechanism that would actively dismantle the kind of financial abuse I had survived. I scheduled a formal meeting with the endowment committee at the University of Alaska Anchorage. I sat in a wood-paneled boardroom across from the dean of admissions and 3 senior financial officers. I placed a bound proposal on the polished mahogany table. I offered them a permanent recurring grant funded entirely by the commercial timber yields. The dean flipped through the proposal. His eyes lit up at the monetary figure. He immediately suggested diverting the funds into the general athletic scholarship pool. He argued that boosting the sports programs would increase overall enrollment and provide great marketing for the university. He tried to flatter me, calling my contribution a wonderful generic gift to the community. I leaned across the table and stopped his pitch. I told him the capital was strictly conditional. I laid out my exact criteria. The scholarship was not for athletes or legacy students. The funds were exclusively reserved for students who could legally prove they received 0 financial contribution from their biological parents. The applicant had to be emancipated and aging out foster youth or demonstrably estranged from their family unit due to financial or emotional abuse. The financial officers shifted in their heavy leather chairs. One of them pushed back. He claimed the criteria were too restrictive and would be an administrative nightmare to verify. He suggested we loosen the parameters to include students from standard low-income households. I looked at the men sitting across from me. They had no concept of what it meant to freeze at a bus stop because your own mother stole your paycheck. I told the dean he had exactly 5 seconds to accept the terms as written, or I would walk out the door and hand the endowment to a rival medical college in Seattle. The dean looked at the hard lines of my face. He recognized that I was not negotiating. He picked up his pen and signed the binding covenant. We launched the Independence Grant the following semester. I insisted on sitting on the final selection panel to interview the top candidates. Late one Tuesday afternoon, I sat in a small campus office reviewing the final file. A 19-year-old girl named Jenna walked through the door. She was wearing a thin jacket that had seen too many winters. Her boots were scuffed, and her hands were raw from the cold. She sat down in the chair across from me, holding a worn backpack on her lap. She looked defensive. Her jaw was tight, anticipating a rejection. I read her file. Jenna worked the graveyard shift at a local diner. She maintained a perfect grade point average. Her parents had kicked her out of their house because she refused to hand over her tip money to cover their gambling debts. She was currently sleeping in the back seat of her car, parking under the streetlights to read her biology textbooks. The university administrators asked her standard questions about her career goals. Jenna answered in short, clipped sentences. She was projecting a tough exterior to hide her exhaustion. I raised my hand and silenced the administrators. I looked directly at Jenna. I asked her how many hours of sleep she got last night. Jenna blinked, surprised by the deviation from the script. She looked at the floor and admitted she had slept for 3 hours because the diner was short-staffed. I reached into my portfolio. I pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope. I slid it across the table until it rested right in front of her. I told Jenna to open it. Her trembling fingers broke the seal. She unfolded the official award letter. The document guaranteed full tuition coverage for 4 years. It included a comprehensive allowance for textbooks. Most importantly, it provided a monthly housing stipend that would allow her to rent a warm, secure apartment near the campus. Jenna stared at the numbers printed on the page. She read the letter twice. The tough, defensive exterior shattered. She dropped the paper on the table and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook as years of accumulated survival stress finally released. I walked around the table and placed my hand on her shoulder. I told her she was safe. I told her she would never have to beg for her survival again. I watched her realize that the grueling, lonely war she had been fighting was officially over. In that small campus office, the cycle of generational trauma was permanently severed. I did not just survive my family, I replaced them. I built every inch of my current life with my own 2 hands. I cultivated a chosen family with Jess and Grandma Evelyn. I created a fortress that protects the people who actually deserve it. I am 24 years old and I am entirely at peace. So here is what I want to leave you with. I am speaking directly to the listener who feels invisible. If you are the forgotten sibling, if you are the glass child, if you are the utility player who fixes every crisis while receiving nothing but criticism in return, stop setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. Stop handing over your hard-earned resources to people who will not even look at the flame. You cannot earn love from individuals who are fundamentally unwilling to give it. They will drain your bank account, your energy, and your youth until there is nothing left but ash. Walking away is terrifying. The guilt will try to pull you back. The flying monkeys will try to shame you. But choosing yourself is not a betrayal. It is the purest form of survival. You have the right to build a locked door. You have the right to curate your own peace. If you have your own story of walking away from a toxic family, if you have learned to build your own table when you were denied a seat at theirs, I want to hear from you. Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for listening to Hazel Tells Stories. And remember, your worth is not defined by their absence. It is defined by the empire you build after you leave. Looking back at the freezing parking lots, the empty auditorium chairs, and the quiet warmth of my new home, I realized that surviving my family was the most profound education I could have ever received. The journey left me with 2 undeniable truths that I carry into every shift at the trauma unit. First blood does not demand your loyalty, it only explains your biology. True family is forged in the trenches of your hardest moments, defined not by shared DNA, but by the people who firmly hold the perimeter when the wolves are at your door. Second, choosing your own peace and establishing impenetrable boundaries is never an act of selfishness. It is an act of absolute survival. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick, and you are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. If my journey resonated with you, or if you are currently fighting to build your own fortress away from the people who are supposed to protect you, please leave a comment below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories for more narratives about survival boundaries and reclaiming life.